Romani people, who you may know as the most hated group in all of Europe. Endless stories of persecution, discrimination, and oppression. However, most of these stories still remain hidden to this day. For example, did you know that Romani people underwent the longest period of human chattel enslavement in the world? And I'm not just talking about the standard slavery that happened throughout history. I'm talking about chattel slavery, a system you may be familiar with when talking about the African diaspora in the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade. My name is Florian, and today I'm going to be telling you about the hidden history of 500 years of Romani slavery. Now, as you may know by now, Romani people are originally from India. And around the 11th century, our people left India due to either war or persecution in search of a better life. We migrated through the Middle East up until the Byzantine Empire. And around the 14th century, Romani people first entered Europe. This is in Eastern Europe where our story begins of chattel slavery. Now, upon entering Europe, the dark skin and Indian origin of Romani people was used to identify them as foreigners and non-Christian, and it was also used to justify enslaving the Romani people. During this time in Europe, the church and its ideals had great powers and influence, such as white being associated with purity and black being associated with impurity. Romani people, because of their dark skin color, were immediately associated with being impure and untouchable. Also, as mentioned previously, Romani people originally practiced Hinduism. Upon reaching Europe, they were still non-Christians and viewed as non-Christians. This allowed another justification for the enslavement of Romani people. Now, Romani people were enslaved all over the Balkans, in places like the Byzantine Empire, Bulgaria, and Serbia. But our story of chattel slavery begins in Romania. But first, what makes chattel slavery different from any other form of slavery? Well, in chattel slavery, the slave or the enslaved person isn't seen as a person. They're seen as property of the slave owner. In chattel slavery, slaves are the legal property of their master, to be bought, sold, and owned forever, including their descendants. The slave owners had the legal right to do whatever they wanted with their slave, including take their slave's life. This was the system that Romani people endured in Romania, or should I say the Romanian principalities of Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania that would go on to form the modern-day state of Romania. The chattel slavery of Romani people in the Romanian territories first began in the 1370s or earlier. The first written testament that we have to this is in 1385. A prince of Wallachia, or modern-day southern Romania, gifted 40 Romani families to a monastery as assets or property. Romani people are organized into 3 different classes of slaves. Slaves of the nobility or aristocrats, known as the boyars or the boieri. Slaves of the Orthodox Church, and slaves of the crown, which would later become slaves of the state. All the Romani people that didn't have a master were considered to be slaves of the state. So almost all the Romani people born in Romania were enslaved. Unlike in the Americas, there wasn't really a class for free people of color. All Romani people, including ones that were mixed with Romanian, were considered slaves because they were Romani. This rule was also applied to any Romani immigrants that entered Romania, except notably Muslim Ottoman citizens, like Ștefan Răzvan. Răzvan was a mixed Wallachian Romani man, whose father was a Muslim Rom from the Ottoman Empire, and because of this, he was born free. Răzvan actually rose through the ranks to becoming a prince of Moldavia, which is the first and only time that Romania had a ruler of verified Romani descent. Now, unfortunately, he was only ruler for a very short time, and he did little to nothing to help the situation of Roma in Romania. Most of the sources that we have about the situation of Romani people in Romania before the Abolition movement actually came from foreign travelers. According to one French traveler, their squires are their absolute masters, they are being Romani people. They sell or kill them like cattle. Their children are born slaves with no distinction of sex, aka chattel slavery. And even though this type of slavery was popular in the European American colonies, on the European continent itself, this was truly a slavery like no other. In fact, due to the actions of the Catholic Church in the 1500s, most of the European continent itself abandoned its classes of slavery. In fact, according to Professor Constantin Bălăceanu Stolnici, Romania in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries was perhaps the only European country to have a distinct class of slaves. During that time period, the word țigan literally meant slave. It took on that meaning. And because of that meaning, many Roma to this day, including myself, do not like that word being used for us and consider it a racial slur. And the enslaved Roma during this time period underwent incredibly cruel treatment. For example, they were forced to wear iron collars with spikes on the inside that would prevent the wearer from lying down or relaxing. And because the slaves were considered the legal property of the slave owners, so they could do whatever they wanted with them, some slave owners took pleasure in torturing their slaves. For example, a common Romanian expression that is still used to this day, "Te-ai necat ca țiganul la mal," you drowned like the gypsy on the shore, comes from a game that slave owners would play with their slaves. The slave owners would tie Romani slaves up in chains and tell them that if they were able to cross the lake and go to the shore, they would have their freedom. So the Romani slaves swam with all their powers until they were up to the shore and they saw their freedom ahead. But right then, they tugged the chains back and prevented them from getting to the shore, leaving them to drown. That was entertainment for the slave owners. Another notable example of this was the infamous Romanian ruler Vlad the Impaler, commonly known for inspiring the character Dracula. Vlad the Impaler had tens of thousands of Romani slaves working for him, and he also enjoyed torturing them. There are reports of him inviting Romani slaves after hard days of labor to a feast in his castle, where he would get them drunk, and after he got them drunk, he would set them on fire. That was entertainment for him. Now, Vlad the Impaler is often considered a national hero in Romania because he helped save it from Ottoman invasion. However, did you know that most of his armies were actually comprised of Romani slaves? The Romani people never received credit for this labor, and all other labor, such as the many monasteries that they built for free all around Romania, and the gold they mined, and all of the work that they did for free. Now, there is actually a separation between Romani slaves that worked outside in the fields and Romani slaves that worked in the house. House slaves, often known as the băiași, were forbidden from speaking the Romani language at risk of having their tongues cut off. And because of this, many of these groups of băiași to this day, such as the Rudar, Lingurar, and so on, still do not speak the Romani language. They also tend to be lighter skinned and more mixed looking, because the Romanian slave masters would impose themselves on Romani women in the house. This is backed by the accounts of foreign travelers who would report seeing Romani people with blonde hair and light-skinned, and said that the Romani people in the house, after years of slavery and their slave masters imposing themselves on them, that they were almost impossible to distinguish from the Romanians. However, even being so mixed, the Romanian law said that if their mother was a slave, if they were born to a Romani slave, that they themselves would be born into slavery, and that the slave owners had power of life and death over them. This is kind of similar to the one-drop rule in America. And there was also a whole slave trade in Romania, where Romani people would be publicly auctioned off for the price of animals, such as the price of a horse or the price of 2 buffalo, and so on. Now, abolition, or the abolishing or ending of slavery, first started when aristocratic Romanians went abroad to study in Western Europe and realized the horrors their country was committing. In fact, one of the primary pieces of literature that helped inspire this movement of abolition was Uncle Tom's Cabin, an American abolitionist novel that detailed the experiences and the horrors that African Americans experienced during chattel slavery in America. That was actually the first American novel that was translated into Romanian. Romanian abolitionists read this book and compared the conditions of African American slaves to the conditions of Romani slaves in their country. They also listened to the arguments of abolitionists in the Americas and realized it was time for change, and their country was doing the same exact thing. One of the prominent Romanian abolitionists, Mihail Cogălnicianu, remembered in his childhood when he saw Romani slaves with their hands and their feet chained, with iron bands around their heads, starved, burned, forced to stay naked in the snow, and so on. The first principality to fully abolish slavery was Transylvania in 1783. It would take the other 2 principalities almost another 100 years for them to abolish slavery completely. Now, in 1843, Wallachia passed the emancipation law that gave freedom to Romani slaves of the state. Now, as you remember, there were also privately owned slaves and slaves of the church. During this time, enslaved Roma of the boyars, or the nobles, tried to use all legal means possible to gain freedom. A notable example of this was Ioana Rudăresa, who was born a Romani slave of the state. During that time, she was illegally and forcefully married off to a Romani slave of a boyar, of the Broiloiu family. This was illegal as slaves of different classes were not allowed to mix. So Ioana tried to go to the courts to prove that she was born a slave of her state and that her and her children were to be free. The Broiloiu boyars, however, fiercely contested this, trying to force her to remain their slave. This process lasted about 10 years as Ioana tried to prove that she was in fact born a slave of the state. She tried to get acquaintances that she had from her childhood. However, because they were also enslaved Roma and not counted as human, their testimonies didn't matter. Ultimately, however, after going to the Supreme Court of Wallachia, the highest court in all of the land, after 10 years of fighting, she finally got freedom for her and her kids. Slavery was finally abolished in the year 1855 in Moldavia and 1856 in Wallachia. In Wallachia, 7% of their population, or 250,000 Romani people, became free in 1856. That leaves a history of over 500 years of Romani chattel slavery, of which not a single reparation has been given. And Romania still refuses to acknowledge its wrongdoings or even give a formal apology. This history is also purposefully hidden by Romania. Romanian schools rarely, if ever, teach about this. For example, my entire family that went to Romanian schools never heard a single word about this. However, the effects of slavery on Romani people in Romania can still be seen to this day. Myths about the innate criminality of Romani people and that stealing is in our blood, that was made up during slavery as a way to justify slavery, are still very popular in Romania to this day as a way to justify the anti-Roma racism that happens there. Romani people to this day are still organized in clans based on our different occupations during slavery. Romani people like the Băiași are still considered caștale by other Roma because they don't speak the language and because they're considered mixed due to that history of slavery. And because no reparations were ever given out, Romani people were left in systemic poverty, and that systemic poverty persists to this day, and the anti-Roma racism that comes with it. Thank you for watching this episode of Romani History by a Romani Person. Next episode will be detailing Romani history in places outside of Romania during this time period. If you learned something new today, please like and subscribe and comment what you would like to see next. Devlesa!